it seems quite incredible that it's now 25 years, a quarter of a century, since the opening of Swindon's Great Western Designer Outlet Village. Of course, the ground behind me, once hallowed ground of the Great Western Railway, the home of the railway workshops here in Swindon, where locomotives were built to steam across the Great Western network, where once men worked and toiled in an industrial situation, people now shop. The hooter sounded for the last time, signalling the end of heavy railway engineering in the town back in March 1986. It marked the end of a relationship with railways that had started almost 150 years before, when the works were established by the Great Western Railway. The workshops had been in decline since the 1960s, and when the end finally came, it was heartbreaking for the 2,300 people that were still employed inside. The challenge for Swindon was what to do with a prime site in the centre of town. It was construction company Tarmac that took on that challenge, demolishing some of the mighty workshops to create a brownfield redevelopment site. But not everything was swept away. In the workshops where once huge and powerful locomotives of the Great Western Railway were built and serviced, time stood still. These workshops were responsible not just for the engines, but also the carriages, wagons, and just about every other item that was needed to run a railway. These images show that much remained unchanged with the passing of time. Although the works were now silent, there was still plenty of life left in the buildings, and using them for a new purpose would help preserve some of the rich architecture that the main railway companies in the United Kingdom were famous for right across the country. The plan was to repurpose many of the buildings, finding a new use for them whilst making the most of their heavy industrial design. BAA Macarthur Glen had already opened a new out-of-town shopping facility in Cheshire and chose the unique Swindon buildings as its next project, a project they called the Great Western Designer Outlet. They were tasked with the challenge of preserving the past whilst converting them for a new role as an outlet shopping village. British Rail had sold the site and the new owners were Tarmac. They were serious about preserving some of the historic railway buildings, understanding the rich history behind these industrial buildings, once the home of the Great Western Railway here in Swindon. And they started with the building behind me, Churchward House.
This was once the jewel in the crown of railway engineering in Britain. When the site was purchased by Tarmac in 1987, it was a derelict shell, inhabited only by memories and the ghosts of the past. But what scenes those ghosts had witnessed, the smoke and fire of the Industrial Revolution arriving in Swindon on wheels of steel and dragging the town into a new age, bringing a new prosperity and honour. And it was the most famous of all the Victorian engineers who was responsible, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. For it was he who chose Daniel Gooch as locomotive engineer to the Great Western Railway. And it was Gooch who initiated and supervised the building of the new engineering works. Swindon had the space, the canal transport for coal, and also it was already the place where Bristol-bound trains picked up a more powerful engine to cope with the increasing gradient. Gooch was to be the driving force behind the works and the design of its locomotives from its founding in 1843 to his retirement in 1868. Gooch saw the Great Western, his first locomotive entirely manufactured at the works, steam out in 1846. Many more were to follow. Gooch's successors, first Joseph Armstrong, then William Dean, accomplished much in the period up to 1902, both in expanding the works, in the quality of the locomotives and the carriages which were produced, and in the changeover from broad gauge to narrow gauge in the late 1860s. But it is the designs and the innovative spirit of their successor which are celebrated in the regeneration of the site. George Jackson Churchward. He ran the works for the first 21 years of this century. During that time, Swindon's reputation reached its zenith due to Churchward's influential designs. His locomotives proved him to be one of the finest railway engineers the world has seen. The expansion of the works since 1843 had kept pace with the expansion of the railways. By 1939, they covered over 326 acres with nearly 80 acres of roofed buildings, the largest single engineering complex in Europe. It wasn't just the works. The town had changed too. By 1939, the original Swindon had been engulfed by the inexorable spread of housing, shops, amenities, and the associated industries which the works supported. The Second World War made use of the works' engineering skills in new ways. From the mounts for giant cross-channel guns firing from Dover, to the landing craft for the invasion of France. But it was a watershed for the works and for the railways. Things would never be the same again. (1948) saw the creation of British Railways and the demise of the Great Western Railway. There was greater centralisation of resources as the country struggled back to prosperity. And the decline of the Swindon Works began, hastened by Dr. Beeching's axing of a large part of the rail network. In 1986, the gates were closed and the clocks stopped.
For almost 10 years the buildings lay empty and most derelict. The sounds of the thousands of railway workers long gone. The buildings a sad reflection that life had moved on and that a major area of Swindon was now no longer useful in a modern town. It was particularly hard for the thousands of men and women that worked inside the workshops, once the heart of the GWR empire and later as part of British Rail Engineering Limited. But plans were being drawn up by American company BAA MacArthur Glen to create one of their new out-of-town shopping centres. The artist's impressions showed for the first time how the buildings could be repurposed sympathetically, converted for a new lease of life, and most importantly bring new visitors to a part of the town that quite simply had died. And so the work began, converting neglected and run-down railway workshops into a brand new shopping complex. The sympathetic work to maintain and highlight the former connection with the railways was emphasised with the inclusion in the complex of one of Swindon's most famous steam locomotives. Ahead of the opening in March 1997, engine number 3440 City of Truro was returned home, a story I reported on at the time.
The historic Great Western Railway locomotive is back in town as part of the opening celebrations for the new Designer Factory Village. The engine will be on display in what will be the food court area of the complex and will be there for all to see when the doors open on March the 13th. The Great Western Designer Outlet Village is the largest retail regeneration project in the country. The site occupies over 200,000 square feet and has parking for over 2,000 cars. It's hoped the £30 million refurbishment of the former railway works will create between 800 and 1,000 new jobs. City of Truro is over 100 tonnes of Swindon history and is believed to be the first steam engine ever to beat the magical 100 mph speed barrier. That happened not long after it was built, hauling prestigious mail trains from Plymouth to London back in 1904. The engine is certainly no stranger to the town. Although built in Swindon, the engine also spent over 20 years housed inside the Great Western Railway Museum in Farringdon Road, before being moved and restored to working order.
The centre opened its doors for the very first time on the 13th of March 1997, and so it was just a few days later that the American ambassador was in town for the official opening. I remember the day well. Hundreds of people turned out, huge excitement as the centre opened its doors for the very first time.
It's exciting to see a community come together to move forward, to adjust to new circumstances, and then to celebrate their justifiable pride. And that, of course, is one of the main things that is happening today.
As midday drew ever closer, it was time at last to officially open the new centre. The grand ceremony got underway with the pulling of a signal lever, signalling the new phase of Swindon's shopping experience.
The many months spent converting the buildings cost over £40 million, turning the disused buildings into a shopping destination. His Royal Highness Prince Charles later toured the site and visited the buildings that were being converted into the new Steam Railway Museum. It was clear for all to see that these had once hosted industrial activities on a colossal scale and were now being carefully transformed for their new role.
And when you think of Swindon, you may think of the Great Western Railway Works. So I personally am delighted it is possible to hold today's conference at this important collection of historic buildings, which I've been looking forward to seeing for a long time, and which lay empty for so many years before the successful regeneration. There are many similar vacant, underused or derelict industrial buildings of comparable historic or architectural merit in all parts of the United Kingdom. They remain as a fascinating legacy from our industrial past. And like this building, many stand at the core of the communities which grew up all around them and remain icons for their towns and cities. But of course, the world has moved on, and with their original purpose gone, all we are left with is the buildings. But these buildings are just as much part of our national heritage as cathedrals, palaces, or country houses. Many were built to the highest architectural standards of their day, and despite the passage of time, remain in remarkably good condition. To have fought for so long to avoid demolition of these works was vindicated just a few weeks ago when the government included the Great Western Railway Line, including these works, on its list of sites nominated for World Heritage status. Indeed, the majority of sites on the list were buildings of architectural or historic importance from our industrial past. This is, at last, a recognition of the value of these buildings.
Ironically, he was also to tour the building known as the Long Shop. At the time, this was the last part of the works still in railway use, being used to help restore preserved steam locomotives. Some of the workforce were the same men that were working in the factory when it was closed down a few years earlier. It was an opportunity to see not only the buildings being used as they were intended, but to see some of those skills that were needed to keep steam locomotives in operation and fit for service. In fact, it was this building that would later go on to be converted as part of the shopping outlet, and provided them with an extension that was completed in 2015 as part of a £40 million investment to create an expanded New Look Centre. Now totalling 250,000 square feet of retail space and 123 stores, building on its position as one of the leading shopping destinations in southwest England. The opening of the Long Shop was the first extension for 16 years of the Swindon Designer Outlet. The chief executive of BAA Macarthur Glen, Joe Kempfer, has been rightly proud of the decision they took not to tear down the historic buildings as part of the site's redevelopment, as could easily have been the case.
The original works here closed in 1986, laying off the last 2,000 of 30,000+ people. And until 1994, these huge echoing buildings lay empty and derelict in the middle of town. Some suggested tearing it down and just starting all over. We, I'm pleased to say, agreed with the people of Swindon that we did not want to do that.
The centre proved to be an instant success, attracting visitors from across the southwest. Not surprisingly, after 2 years of operation, the centre management was delighted with trading at the shopping outlet.
We're delighted actually, and since we did open in March '97, we've actually seen our business grow year on year. We're looking this year probably to exceed 5 million visitors, and that's against a 4 million visitor visit for our first year. So yeah, we're naturally very pleased.
Marketing the Great Western Designer Outlet to people outside of Swindon, as well as locals, was in the hands of the centre's marketing manager, Iona Carter. In this interview, looking back at the successes from the first 2 years of operation.
There's so many, I think. Just opening the centre was one of the most amazing highlights, as you can see by the building itself. I think the second is obviously visits from Princess Anne, being recognised as a heritage centre and being, Fred Taggart from the Heritage. I said it's one of the best buildings he's ever seen converted, and that's a highlight to us. Winning 3 marketing awards in the first 2 years for media and for promotions that we do here, and a European marketing award, that was quite a highlight as well.
The sympathetic conversion of the buildings won acclaim from far and wide, and some of those most vocal in lending their support were the former railway workers themselves.
They were over the moon because they can still pick out definite areas that they've worked in. Our management suite, for instance, was the old pattern store, and we've had many a customer just simply walk up the stairs, knock on the door and come in and say, I used to work here, and I think that's the beauty of the village.
There was much talk about the outlet village becoming a shopping destination, and that was enforced when the centre won an award from the South West Tourist Board.
It was given, they felt that they look at the centre as a visiting place, not as somewhere to shop. They think it's viewed as it's a day out. Like Alton Towers or going to Blackpool Tower or whatever. It's viewed in the same class, and we had as many visitors as Alton Towers in their first year. So that's what it was given for, just being an interesting place to come and see and not only shop.
The work done to preserve our slice of history and find a use for the former Railway Works buildings has proved to be extremely positive. The centre has had millions of visitors and attracted great praise for the sympathetic conversion work. There have been a number of royal visits, including Princess Anne, and that by His Royal Highness Prince Charles. Prince Charles took the opportunity to see for himself the results of the conversion work and just what could be achieved by keeping historic buildings with a rich history and repurposing them for their new role. His walkabout proved popular as he met and chatted to some of the visitors to the centre.
Are you all trying to do your shopping? You're trying to get your shopping done. Have you managed to film that?
Over the last 25 years, literally millions of people have visited Swindon's Great Western Designer Outlet Village. It's provided important employment on this site once again, and it's ensured that Swindon's historic industrial buildings are preserved for future generations. Here's to the next 25 years.